In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee, be happening through Christ our Lord. Amen. Our Lady of Divine Grace, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. One of the things you see from time to time on the internet and discussions about it, and also there's a group called Exodus 90 that encourages it, and it's called media fasting. Fasting obviously deals with food, and it's where you abstain from food. And the reason we abstain from food is for two reasons. One is for health purposes, but which we're going to talk a little bit even in relationship to media fasting. There are some health issues that are starting to arise that they're noticing with these things. But the second component is it's just a matter of moderating the pleasure that we get out of the food. And the same thing actually applies to the media. TV, the computer, the telephone, things of this sort, smartphones are actually good things, they're not evil things, contrary to the Luddites and contrary to the theory of John Senior. John Senior held the idea that TV was intrinsically evil, and first of all, that's impossible, just on a metaphysical, at least from a Thomistic metaphysical analysis, that's just not possible to assert that. Does it have its problems? It can, but not necessarily in and of itself. Even the things that it does, even the physiological effects it has on people, which we'll talk about in a little bit, itself can be useful under certain circumstances. So the point being is that we get a certain pleasure out of using technology. Vogelin, who was a philosopher in this last century, made the observation that we get a pleasure out of each time that we use a form of technology. And as a result of that, he said we should do some type of penance subsequent to that in order to keep the intemperance at bay. In other words, it's very easy because of the pleasures involved in using those to become very intemperate in two senses. One is pursuing the pleasures of it that are illicit, but then the other is just immoderate, which you tend to see with most good Catholics, are just being immoderate in relationship to it. So what we want to do then is we want to discuss two things first before we even discuss how we should really moderate it. You've all seen this chart more times than you probably really want to watch it. Okay, so we have the five senses. And the five senses are unified by the common sense power, which expresses the image from the senses into the imagination, and at the same time expresses it into memory. This is how you can be in a location and then reflect on it, not paying attention to something, and then later reflect on it, remembers things about it. Then there's the cogitative power, which looks at the image and the imagination, goes back into the memory, digs up what's there, that by association looks at the things that are similar to it, brings that information back into the image, right? That's preparing of it. It can also make an assessment about what's in the image based either on past, that is what's in the memory, that it was pleasurable or it was painful, or just by estimating that this thing could be good or harmful, and as a result it makes an assessment of its being good or bad purely on a physical level. Is it going to lead to pain or is it going to lead to pleasure? That's what it's doing at that level. And then from that it can put a perspective on the image. St. Thomas calls that ratio, which is a particular perspective. Then the appetites are then moved based upon the particular perspective. They're moved in a particular way. So they have a particular kind of motion internally based upon the particular perspective, and that we call emotion. Okay. Which the primary ones we're going to talk about are the three, which are love, delight, and desire, because those play a role in this whole discussion of the media. Then the agent intellect abstracts from the image to concept. It places it in the possible intellect. Then I have understanding. I understand what this thing is. Okay. Then the possible intellect looks at the concept and then makes a judgment and compares it with what's in the image. That is, St. Thomas says it converts back to the phantasm. to make a judgment. Dogs are furry, for example. So the concept is dogs, and then it looks back to see that some of them are furry. Okay, so make a judgment. That's then presented to it can be a judgment of its moral good or badness, and then that's presented to the will. The will then either moves the intellect to reconsider things differently or make a different judgment, but in the end it ends up moving the image and the imagination. Okay. So this is the general structure that what happens. Okay, so normally with the five senses, we're actually dealing with objective reality. Here we're just dealing with reality. In relationship to the media, what happens is various forms of media are precisely that. They're media, that is, they're mediums between the reality and our senses. They're objectively real too, they're part of reality, but what they're doing is they're presenting things that pertain to reality, or should pertain to reality, in a particular format, that is in a particular way, which we call the medium. And then, as a result, our contact with reality, at least in relationship to that particular thing, is affected by the medium. The medium becomes part of this whole sense experience, and it's brought into the imagination. Okay. So what that really means is that we have to be careful about the content of the media. We're going to talk about that in just a bit. Back up. So, how does it cause pleasure? Well, first we have to define what pleasure is, because then that will help just a little bit. It actually causes several different kinds of pleasure using various technological devices. Which, by the way, I'm a big technological guy too, but there has to be a certain moderation in relationship to it. First, the definition of pleasure is that it's a supervening good. I think we've talked about this here. Supervening good in a well-disposed faculty in relationship to the object of the faculty, in relationship to the object. So what does it mean it's a supervening good in a well-disposed faculty? Well, it's pretty easy. Take food, for example. If you're sick, you're not well-disposed. So if you're sick and then someone comes up to you, or let's use the example in the Monty Python, since we're talking about media. There's a Monty Python skit where this guy is so fat and he eats so much food that he's on the verge of literally blowing up, right? And somebody brings up a little mint, says to him, "Would you like this mint?" And the guy's not feeling well from having eaten so much because that means his disposition is something. So the mint isn't going to give him the same kind of pleasure it would as if he was hungry. And he says no. And finally they convince him to eat it. He eats it and then he literally blows up, right? Okay. So, not that I'm suggesting you watch that skit, but the point being is that his disposition, because he's already full, means that he's not that if he eats something, it's going to cause pain instead of pleasure. Because the pleasure comes when the faculty is well disposed. We notice this when we're hungry and we eat, the pleasure we get out of the food is increased than when we're not hungry, for example. We also notice this just listening to music. If we're not in a particular mood, that is the disposition, our emotional disposition, if we're not disposed towards, listening to suppose someone just died, a friend of ours just died, and we're kind of sad, and then someone comes along, playing, happy music, it's just going to annoy us, right? We're not going to get any pleasure out of it. Whereas if they start playing this sad music, then what'll happen is that we get a certain pleasure out of it, because there is this, I forgot one other thing, in a well-disposed faculty in relationship to objects in action, okay. So in relationship to listening to the music, which is the action, so you basically have, so here's the faculty, and then here's the object. There's an activity that I'm engaging in, such as eating, and the pleasure is the thing that supervenes or comes above, that God adds on top of the actual achieving of the object. That's that's the structure of pleasure. When it comes to the medium, there's actually two forms of pleasure that arise out of it in relationship to it. The first is the actual object that it's presenting. So it could be presenting as some kind of information or knowledge about underwater basket weaving. You know, I'm an expert underwater basket weaver, and someone has discovered a new technique. So I'm scouring the internet trying to find that new technique, and I find it, and I'm reading it. And so just reading that information gives me a certain pleasure in getting the knowledge. Okay. The second one is the medium itself. Actually can provide a certain pleasure just in its use. Why is that? Well, it's very easy. It's a tool. And basically, as a medium and as a tool, it puts us into contact or facilitates our ability to achieve an end very easily, right? So, for example, if I need to know something like, I used to use this from time to time when I had a particular kind of a car, I would look up on the internet, if I had a problem with the car, I'd look up on the internet how involved of his job is this. Being a mechanic, I could fix it anyway, but I just wanted to know how much time am I looking at in order to fix this thing. And so I'd go on the internet and look at it, and then it would give me that information, but it was very quick and very easy. And as a result of that, there's a certain pleasure we get out of it. Even just using a washing machine, Vogelin was talking about, just using a washing machine, right? Because you don't have to go through the drudgery of hauling your clothes down to a stream using a washboard or a rock to try and clean your thing. You just throw them in, you leave, you come back, and they're done. And the fact that they're done gives us a certain amount of pleasure. So that the medium itself, the technology itself, provides, in its facility of what we're trying to achieve, provides a pleasure on its own. Okay. So then, where does that pleasure reside? Well, it usually doesn't reside in the senses itself, although sometimes it can, you know. But usually that's not where it's, you know, it's not like someone sees a new computer and they have to go feel it and they're like, oh, this is just wonderful. I love the feel of this. That's not how that usually works. Usually what they like about a new computer is the fact that it's faster, which means it facilitates what they want more quickly and more rapidly. How do we know that that's actually true? One, because of our own common experience. You use the computer and it gives you what you want and you're chipper, right? When it starts acting up, which I call the Gates factor, stuff starts going wrong with the software. As one person said, there is no hardware which Gates cannot slow down with his software. So, you know, all of a sudden it starts getting slower and slower and slower, and it starts aggravating us because it's not facilitating that. We're not getting the same pleasure out of it. Okay, so where does that pleasure reside? It resides in actually 4 places. It can reside in the concupiscible appetite, in the form of delight. I like this. This is really good, right? I got to see this thing or watch this thing or whatever on YouTube. Okay. It can also be in the imagination itself, in the sense of it's an intellective pleasure in just knowing the information on a certain level. This is one of the, and we notice this just, you know, like someone will say, hey, did you see this video about X? And we're like, no, I didn't. And then you go and you see it, and just watching the thing brings a certain amount of pleasure in coming to the information. So the information, the imagination receives, there's a certain pleasure in the imagination just in seeing that, even though it's not an appetitive faculty. That's why St. Thomas talks about, like, for example, beauty. Beauty, he says, is that which is pleasing to a cognitive faculty, not an appetitive, but a cognitive faculty. So even our cognitive faculties, when we're engaging in knowing, because that's what the action is, knowing, the object that we want to know, and the faculty is well disposed. If it's really hard to work on, have you ever noticed this? When you're dealing with some type of new knowledge or something that you're not very good at, you're not well disposed to it, which means you don't have a lot of intellectual virtue. If you've noticed, it's harder and there's not much pleasure. It's not until you get a certain facility to it that you actually get an intellectual pleasure in considering these things, generally speaking, unless there's some real appetitive desire to know it. And so in the act of knowing itself, there can be this supervening good of the pleasure we get out of just viewing the thing, just seeing it on a imaginative level. And what happens is, and this means the media itself, if it's, for example, watching a video, if it's well done, and the color is just right, and the scenery is just right, and the dialogue is just right, all of it comes together in an artistic expression which has a certain level of perfection. The cogitative power is simply going to assess it as good on that level, not even giving it a moral analysis. And so we can just get a pleasure out of just watching those things on that level. This is one of the difficulties in relationship to the movies. They've gotten so adept at doing that now that people are getting so much into this level of the movie that they're not analyzing the moral aspect of the movie at all, which is a very separate kind of consideration. Okay. Then we can make a judgment, and if the judgment results in the truth, which is the proper object of the intellect, and I actually want to know the truth. If I don't want to know the truth, it's going to cause me pain and dissonance. But if I want to know the truth, then what's going to happen is when I make the act of judgment, just on a purely intellectual level, we're not even talking about an imaginative level, but on an intellectual level, there's a pleasure that the intellect gains in actually knowing the truth. You can kind of see this when you hear somebody giving a lecture where it's laid out so logically and so well, and it's so clear. That's part of the aspect of truth, that there's clarity. So when you ever hear these ecclesiastics saying, well, why does everybody want this clarity? That's a sign of a moral problem, by the way. But that there's a certain clarity, there's a cohesion to it, that there's actually a burning sensation intellectually that we get. The apostles talked about that, or the disciples, I should say, on the road to Emmaus, when Christ starts talking and explaining why he had to suffer in order to do this. They said, were not our hearts burning internally? What that is it's not just an imperative thing, it's an intellectual thing where the intellect is seeing the truth and it's converging on it. It really wants the thing almost. And so there's a pleasure that's being gained out of seeing this stuff unlocked for us. Okay. Then the last one is in the will, because the will, if the medium is quick and does what we want, and if it provides us the object that we want, then the will gets a certain satisfaction in attaining what it has chosen. In other words, it makes a choice for something, and so there's a certain self-will that can be developed over the course of time with these things if we're not careful in relationship to the will. Okay. This is how the media works. This is the pleasures, various pleasures that it gives. So basically we have to work on a few things in order to counteract it, because if we don't, as St. Thomas says, he says, pleasure is a good thing. It's actually necessary for recreation. That is, the soul needs it, or the body actually needs it to some degree in order to get to the point where we can go back to working again, right? So we shouldn't work in order to get the pleasure. We actually use the pleasure in order to be able to work. And so he says that if you get too little pleasure, then you end up with insensitivity. You just can't even sense the goods of things at all. They don't mean anything. You don't have any reaction to them, etc. You don't see them as good. He says, on the other hand, he says, if there's too much pleasure, it ends up in spiritual dissipation, which really means what? That the faculties start to become attached to the pleasure, and in that process, they become intemperate, which means that your spiritual life is declining, and your intellectual perception is being affected, etc., which we'll talk about in a bit. So certain things are happening in that process. So therefore, we know, therefore, that there has to be something in relationship to the faculties where we have to kind of get them back under control. Okay. These are not evil things. Getting the pleasure out of these things is not evil. It's just it has to be moderated, and it has to be legitimate pleasures. Okay. Initial studies, they're doing a lot of studies now about our interaction with technology, have shown that I just read this last night because I was taking a look at a few things, and what they've discovered is, and we can see this already, if I'm constantly engaging or frequently engaging in a media without counteracting it at any point, what happens is the appetite being constantly fed the object that it wants. What happens is when the object's taken away, the appetite experiences pain or sorrow. And so if we don't moderate that, it's because ultimately we should have detachment from all these things, which means what? I can take it or leave it. I can take joy and delight in it, but then I can walk away from it. If I see it, I don't have to look at it, right? Which is a real issue with the phone, I think. But the point being is that, so what happens is the appetites start to become stronger as they're constantly fed their object when they're never denied the object. This means that, for example, when we go to pray, we're going to be distracted and all over the place. And the reason being is because if we're constantly giving our appetites what they want, when they're not getting what they want, then the appetites are going to start clamoring for their object, and they're going to be annoyed that they're not getting their object. But what they've discovered is that those who have a lot of interaction with electronic media are suffering a reduced ability to process their emotions. Interesting. That people who have all sorts of contact with the media and they're not moderating it, they basically they can't process their emotions properly. It's an interesting observation, which basically we see just in taking a look at it from a Thomistic point of view. Excessive use, therefore, because of that, okay, now getting back to this, if you're using it a lot, what you're really doing is you're feeding the lower faculties, right? When you're using it an awful lot, this is the section that's getting fed the most. Why? Because the very nature, the more the media begins to approximate this process, the more we like it. A TV does to some degree. It gives us prepackaged images that have a particular perspective on it. It gives those to us. This is one of the things that's good about certain movies, is they can provide that actually. You can actually, that's the sad thing about movies, is they can actually, and videos, they could actually be used to form people in having the proper associations regarding certain things, but in fact, we're doing the opposite. Okay. That being said, it tends to feed this. What happens is in the end, because this is what's being fed all the time, this starts to take a life on of its own. We just saw that with the appetites. It also means that the cogitative power, if in certain forms of media, the information comes immediate, right? That's the nature of it. It comes very, very rapidly, right? So what they're finding is with children is those who watch a lot of this stuff or have access to the internet a lot or playing lots of video games, the cogitative power becomes used to very rapid imagery that's being constantly fed to it. And that's how it's being trained, because this is one of the most trainable powers there are. When the kid is taken out of that and put in the classroom, this thing still has its habit and its training, and so the kid is climbing the walls. Because why? It's looking for this cogitative power, is waiting for the next image, and it's not coming with the same rapidity, because in order to gain certain kinds of knowledge, you have to stop, pause, and look at something for long periods of time without changing the imagery. Or you have to constantly adding to the imagery rather than changing it. And so this is one of the reasons why they know there's a direct correspondence between the lots of media and ADD. The other thing that they're noticing is that with children under a certain age, if they watch, I think it's under 5, because there's a lot of development that's going on in the brain, and if they watch too much TV or have too much screen time, it literally rewires the brain and causes physical brain damage. So this is something that, again, these things aren't evil. It just means that they have to be moderated, and even more so with children. So getting back to this means that since this is used to that rapidity of imagery, in order to develop intellectual virtue, which are habits in the possible intellect, which give my ability to judge things with precision, so that I can actually know the truth about certain things. So, for example, I don't know a whole lot about biochemistry, but my cousin does. He's got his doctorate and teaches pharmaceutical chemistry. And so whenever I have a question, I just go and ask him about it. What's the story with this, that, or the other thing, right? And he and I can look at the exact same thing, and what he sees, for example, in a chemical formula, and what I see are two different things. Even though we're seeing the same formula, intellectually, his grasp and understanding of what's in that formula is completely different from mine, which is much more shallow or virtually nil, right? But the inversion is also the case. If he and I start talking philosophy, I can tell when I start talking philosophy, he kind of checks out a little bit, right? Which is okay. I mean, that's just part of it. But this means is that in order to have deep intellectual virtue, which is, by the way, this intellectual virtue, these habits are called knowledge. That's what it is. There's a difference between sense knowledge. What's happening is people are getting all sorts of sense knowledge. They're getting data, but they're not developing this, so they can't judge the data properly. And so the point being is that they're not developing the habits of mind that are necessary in order to judge things to greater depth. This is why as time goes on, unless we got to get a handle on this and use it in the proper way, the education system is going to continue to degrade, especially as they bring more of this stuff in. They're also finding that in certain circumstances, you need that in this. You need technology in certain subjects and in certain purviews, but there's other ones where you have to get them out because it actually becomes the problem. It becomes between the person and reality to a certain degree. So what's happening is there's a decline of intellectual habit and virtue. So that's one of the things that's happening. In an experiment in 1969, Herbert Krugman monitored a person through many trials and found that in less than 1 minute of television viewing, the person's brain waves switched from beta waves, those are the ones that are associated with active logical thought, right? So that's the brain waves you put out when you're thinking logically and actively, to primarily alpha waves, which is basically the logical thought basically stops or is reduced significantly. And so what he noticed is that when the subject stopped watching the television and began reading a magazine, the brain waves went back to the beta waves. In other words, went back to thinking logically. So what this means is the television causes a reduction in the beta waves, and as a result, there's some people saying it's dumbing us down. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to dumb us down. It's just if you're watching it and that actual reduction of the beta waves can be helpful. For example, if you have somebody who is like super scrupulous and constantly, ruminating about absolutely everything, you stick them in front of a television and say, here, watch this for a while, right? Because that'll get the rumination to stop. That'll get them to quit processing stuff. It'll get them to start focusing on stuff. And if what's being presented properly, what is being presented is properly proposed as true and good, etc., then the person can begin to start seeing things differently. You can retrain the cogitative power by means of the media. That's the reason that it's useful. Okay. In another study, MRI scans found significant differences in the brains of some children who reportedly using smartphones, tablets, and video games more than 7 hours a day. Which, by the way, it sounds an enormous amount to adults, but a lot of kids, that's what they're doing. Children who reported more than 2 hours a day of screen time got lower scores on thinking and language tests. In other words, the kids who hardly used it. Okay. One thing this indicates is that most parts of the brains, parts responsible for logical thought, tune out during television watching. Again, it doesn't mean that they're bad, because actually a moderate amount of use of that can be good, because if you've been spending your whole day processing thoughts and solving problems and dealing with certain things and thinking that logically, sometimes you just need to shut down a little bit. And so sitting in front of a TV for, half an hour is not necessarily bad. It just has to be. But the real problem is that once we start doing that, then we get the pleasure out of it, and then it can kind of become the focus. As I mentioned, because this media gives us information or data so quickly, it can also fuel curiosity. For example, you see this a lot with people who are constantly researching the internet for this, that, or the other thing, and you're like, do you really need to know that? I mean, sometimes you do, obviously, but a lot of times people are pursuing knowledge that's not proper to the state in life. I wonder what Brad Pitt is doing today. Well, who cares what Brad Pitt is doing? What's that got to do with your spiritual life? Or, what's Father Ripperger say about this? Who cares what I say about this? It should really ultimately be what is the truth, and you may not necessarily need to know that, right? And you don't need to know where I am and what I'm doing, etc. Okay, not that that's interesting anyway. All right. This also means that because it gives us a pleasure, if it's not moderated, then we end up with a problem of intemperance, but we can also end up with a twofold problem, and that is effeminacy and sloth. So if you recall, for those of you who have listened to my other conferences, effeminacy is an unwillingness to put aside one's pleasure in order to pursue what is arduous or difficult. That's what effeminacy is. Okay. So obviously there's two components. St. Thomas says on the side of effeminacy, the principal part is the pleasure. That's what the person is focusing on. And the arduous, one does not pursue the arduous, but that's primarily because his real focus is, and the arduous doesn't provide pleasure, and so as a result of that, he gets stuck on the pleasures. You see this, I've said this about a lot of the millennials, not all of them, some of them are actually very manly, but a lot of the millennials, they spend so much time on the internet, they spend so much time on video games, they're, and this is one of the things I said, look at a video game which is actually designed for a 16-year-old, you got a guy who's 35, 40 years of age still playing it. That's a problem, right? He should really be pursuing goods that are more noble and proper to his state as an adult, etc. It's that St. Paul says, when I was a child, I acted like a child, but when I became an adult, I acted like an adult, right? There has to be a certain point where you put aside certain pleasures, not because they're bad, but because of the fact that they're not proper to your state. You're older now. You should be actually pursuing the pleasures or the goods that are more noble, that ennoble the spirit. But the point being is that we see this in relationship to them. They'll spend hours and hours and hours and hours on that, and then you ask them to go mow the lawn, and you act like you just extracted their teeth without Novocaine, right? Their reaction is just like completely disproportionate to what you've asked them to do. The other problem is because they spend so much time in the effeminacy, there's obviously an intemperance, as I mentioned. But the inability or the unwillingness to pursue the arduous means there's no fortitude. The minute things get a little bit difficult, they just die out. Like, for example, you see this in relationship to their work histories. They go to a job, a couple months in, it gets a little bit difficult, they bail and move to another job. That gets a little bit difficult, they bail and move to another job, right? And so this is one of the signs that there's a lack of temperance. It's not entirely because of that it's because of the media or the technology, but there's reasons. That's part of it. There's other reasons, but that's part of why that's actually the case. Sloth, St. Thomas says, is also an unwillingness to give up the pleasure in order to pursue the arduous. But here, the difference is in sloth, the emphasis is, I don't want to engage. A person who's slothful does not want to engage in the things that are arduous because they're painful. And so the person who's slothful tends to pursue things that are pleasurable just because he just doesn't want to engage what's arduous. How do you know that you have sloth? It's very simple. When you think to yourself, I really should work on this, or I should be praying, and instead you go, I'm just going to go look this up on the internet, or I'm going to go watch this video, or I'm going to go do this, right? I'm going to watch some TV or what have you, rather than actually pursue what's arduous. Very often you see it in the context of reading, I'll ask people, did you do spiritual reading? No. How much videos are you watching a day? About 2 hours. There's obviously a problem here. The point being is that the person who is arduous is actually a person who suffers from flight. He's trying to avoid pain. Whereas the effeminate person, this is based on desire. He wants his pleasures at the time in which he wants it. Now, this is one of the other problems that we also see when a person is working a lot with the technology. If they don't moderate it, what can happen is when it comes time to do a certain amount of work, they're thinking to themselves, oh man, I'd like to be back there, just sitting in front of the TV watching this or that, rather than focusing on their work. So the desire starts to rise up. And one of the ways that you know that there's a problem in that area is if you come to a situation where you actually have to divert your attention, time, and energy to something else legitimately. Is there any fussing internally? That is, emotionally, is there anything going on internally? If it's totally, it's like, oh, okay, and it doesn't bother you, then that means you have a certain detachment. But if there's not, that means there's kind of an attachment. St. Augustine says that he who owns a thing, the thing owns him. This is really true is also in relationship to technology. Again, it's not evil. It's a good thing. In fact, one time I was talking to this one guy, and he says, what has technology gotten us? Well, first of all, it's self-evident. Our culture, we live in a culture where there's a great amount of leisure. Now, we should be using that to pursue more noble things, but the technology's freed us up to do all sorts of other stuff. then we would have to be doing otherwise. And so at a certain point, so he's trying to convince me that technology is evil, and I'm like, yeah, that's just not the case. I mean, it's a good thing. It's a tool. It's like any other useful good. It's just like any other useful good. It just has to be used for the thing it's designed for and moderately. Well, so he of course, he doesn't convince me in the slightest. But then that afternoon, he goes out and buys his wife a washing machine. And I'm like, well, you're a hypocrite. You should tell your wife to go down, and by the way, she can't use a board. That's a piece of technology. She should just be using the rocks, right? The point being is that there's a bit of dishonesty because people don't tend to look at these things honestly. So the technology is a good thing. It just has to be used with decorum, that is, in relationship with the thing that it ought to be used and moderately. So in other words, excessive use can begin sloth, and here we're not talking about, this is not just laziness, which, by the way, the authors tend to call laziness, this is physical sloth. This is the guy who literally will not get off the couch, right? Unless he's starving to death, then he might move an arm to reach over to grab a potato chip. But the fact is that this is the guy that just simply physically won't do anything. Spiritual sloth is different from that. Spiritual sloth is pursuing the spiritual goods. And St. Thomas says that spiritual goods are arduous. They're hard. And it's much easier just to go watch a TV show or look at a video or surf the internet or things like that. Part of the other sign of moderate, that it's a problem with moderateness, is the amount of time people spend on it and not even realize it, right? So they can get on the internet and then 3 hours later they're getting off like, oh man, it's noon already, right? And that's a sign that, again, it's not that these things are bad and they can be used for the good, but it can also be a sign that the person's he's giving more into the pleasure more than he is actually focusing on what he really needs off of this thing and get on and then get off. As I mentioned, it erodes fortitude by providing immediate gratification so consistently that the individual can easily become habituated in relationship to it. So we're laying out what the problem is. I'm going to talk about how we should approach it. They also know through various studies that the screen time can affect sleep, cause obesity. It causes numerous different kind of health problems when there's too much of it, right? We also know, as I mentioned, because the will is constantly getting what it wants, when it's each time you make a choice to click on this thing or that thing, or you watch this movie or that movie, what's happening is the will is getting what it wants, and it's getting a pleasure out of it, which means what? We're building self-will. So that when something else comes along and it's contrary to that will, it's going to be hard for us to choose that thing. So it actually weakens the will in the process. There's another thing, which is the last thing we'll talk about, and then we'll actually talk about what do you do to counteract this. One of the things that they've noticed, I might get the statistics wrong, so don't quote me exactly on this, but this is the general gist of it. 20 years ago, they did a study, and they said the average time from which a person got information off the internet to the time they forgot it was about 22 to 25 seconds. Then they did it again about 10 years ago, and it had been reduced down to 11 seconds. They said now the average time from which somebody looks something up on the internet to the time they forget it is somewhere between 3 and 5 seconds. And it's called electronic or digital amnesia. People are simply, they look stuff up and they forget it. Why? Because what's happening is St. Thomas, if you look at the memory, and its relationship to the imagination, cogitative power, in the scholastic period, they would become so proficient in memorization that St. Thomas was known to be able to sit down and read an entire book of the Bible and have memorized in one sitting 95% of it. One sitting. Today, people can't even remember what their telephone number is. Right? So that's how bad it's gotten. So what does this mean? It means that the memory is a habituatable power, and you can perfect it. Why is this important? They considered the obligation to perfect your memory a moral obligation binding under prudence. Why? because prudence needs information. It needs the information from your past, the right information from your past, in order to judge what's the prudent thing to do here. And so if you're just never in the process of remembering anything, then what their attitude is, well, that's just going to be a reduction in prudence, and that itself is imprudent. So that this is one of the reasons why it's, there should be certain things that are be done in order to memorize, to develop that techniques. I think it's Vost is his name. Kevin Vost has a book called Memorize Your Faith. And in there he talks about the Loci method, which is the one which St. Thomas and the scholastics used in order to memorize things. But the point being is that people have to develop their memory in order to be able to be really good at this kind of thing, which is kind of interesting because all of the people that I've come across that worked in Hollywood, all of them have phenomenally good memories. They're all of them that I've come across whose memories are really good, who they can look at a sequence of lines and memorize it in one pass, are the people who have very moderated use of technology, ironically. It's the people that are constantly at it that when they go to do the acting, they have a hard time remembering. The point being is that this is something which is, our memories are basically atrophying because the technology gives it too quickly, and we don't take the energy, which is arduous, we don't take the energy to store it in our mind or to think about it a little bit in order so that it stays. So what about media fasting? So what media fasting essentially is it is the moderated use of technology in its various forms. And so what that essentially looks like is, obviously, if you're talking about stuff that's required for your duties of your state in life, you may not be able to moderate them in quite the same way, but you should at least try and be detached from them to some degree. So obviously, you need the washing machine and you need, the conveniences of a modern kitchen in order to fulfill your duties of your state in life. But on the other hand, it's one of those things that you should be working on the detachment from that. In relationship to the telephone, I tell people, unless you have a job, right, or there's some necessity based upon your state in life, you don't need to be paying that much attention to your phone. So you don't need to be, every time you hear the bling, go check your voice, your texts, for example. In fact, rarely are texts emergency. If it's emergency, people normally call. But the point being is that there should be times where you're just not looking at the thing. You make the choice not to look at it. So a lot of my spiritual directees, I'll tell them, you're only allowed 3 minutes. You're only allowed 3 minutes per hour at the top of the hour to check your messages. That's it. Boom. And every single one of them, what they find out is, because of this rapidity of imagery and stuff that we're getting, and also this thing that constitutes a gargantuan distraction. In other words, it's fracturing people's ability to pay attention or focus, because they're working on one thing and they keep getting drugged to another thing, and they keep getting drugged to another thing, so they get drugged to another thing, and what's happening is the lower faculties are being habituated not to be focusing on one thing for a long period of time. This is why people go to read and they find it extraordinarily difficult. Okay, so that's one of the problems with that. So I just tell people, check it at the top of the hour or check it at certain times. Another form of media fast is only using the internet on your phone for things that are necessary, not just to look them up, which is one of the things that I've got to keep working on myself. But it's one of those things where you just have to, anytime you see, you think, I wonder what about X? Well, if you don't know it, you don't know it. You go research it later, or what have you, unless it's necessary for the discussion at hand. In relationship to the computer, it just means it has to be moderated. It's a tool. You get on, you get what you need to know, and you get off. Okay. The TV is one of those things that, again, it's not evil. I think it should just be worked into what should be a general regimented life, where this is the time in which I take time for downtime, and so I'm going to watch a little bit of TV. That's fine. Okay. But it should be moderated. Right? It shouldn't be several hours a day. Well, this is one of the real problems with older people. They're literally sitting around hours and hours and hours a day just watching television. Well, that's idleness. They should be doing other things, like reading or doing other things. There's still stuff they could learn about their faith and things of that sort. There are times in which by media fasting it means that there should be a certain kind of discipline we should be exercising all the time in relationship to these things. But then we can go through periods like, for example, during Lent. So in the last Lent, basically I didn't watch any videos. I didn't look at anything on the internet except in the morning to check the news for 15 minutes. Generally speaking, sometimes it was a little longer, but 15 minutes. I didn't answer my voicemails or emails except for at certain times during the day. Then also and no videos at night, right, or any other time except for what was necessary for my job. And what I notice is because you're not constantly moving from thing to thing and you're not feeding this constant beast, so to speak, its pleasure, there's a real interior quieting that occurs. You're much more at peace, you're much happier, you're less distracted, your ability to focus is better, etc. Again, I'm not saying these things are evil, they just have to be moderated. So there might be times like during the Advent or Lent where you actually want to just cut out all of it except for what's absolutely necessary for your state in life. As an exorcist, one of the first things that we do, because this constantly pursuing all this stuff through the media and through the various forms of technology, we're finding that people have this dissipation. They're extraordinarily undisciplined. And so what happens is we'll put them on a prayer prescription and they'll come back 30 days later, well, I kind of did it and I kind of didn't do it. One of the things that's helped tremendously in that area is we tell them absolutely no media except for what is absolutely necessary for your state in life, nothing else. And what we found is that when you take that out of it, there's usually a bit of chaffing at first about it. But then once that is taken out, what we've found is people can get into the groove and they can actually do it. But until if they don't do that, we've found that it's not very helpful. This is one of the reasons why the Exodus 90, I think, is good, because it actually provides men have a bigger problem with this than women. And that's because of the fact, for two reasons. One is that we are more ordered towards use of tools than women. And that's because it helps them to accomplish this stuff easily and well. The second component is that St. Thomas says that guys are more inclined towards the third form of operations of the cogitative power, whereas women are more inclined towards the second. The second one is assessing whether something is good or bad on a physical level, right? Whereas the third one is to prepare the thing for abstraction, for more abstract thought. And as a result of that, doesn't mean women can't do abstract thought. It just means there's a predominance of inclination. And as a result of that, because it feeds men more that desire to pursue things that give the cogitative power its preparation and information for preparation. And so men have a harder time, I find, regulating it, but that's one of the real problems. It also makes them more effeminate, which is one of the difficulties. The point being is that there's certain times of the year, during Lent and Advent, that people should just really cut down on that, just like they do food or other things that they enjoy. Then if a person's finding they're having difficulty, then just go on a media fast. Just go on it, period. If you're doing a lot of intellectual work, like studying philosophy and theology, you pretty much have to put it aside, except for when it's absolutely necessary, because otherwise it's going to start affecting your ability to think with depth and clarity. So, and other people that I've talked to have noticed that once they went off that, their ability to engage in things for long periods of time and in depth came back much more rapidly. Okay, so technology is not evil. It's just like anything else. It has to be moderated. All right. Any questions? Yes.
Father, is the cogitative power then something that's primarily physical?
It is, yeah.
Also, I was wondering, can arduous goods sometimes provide pleasure if one is well disposed?
Yes, but only, they don't provide pleasure, normally speaking. What they do is they provide delight in relationship to the person who's virtuous. Because the virtue means the fact that he's well disposed to engage the thing that's arduous. The thing that's arduous is painful, right? But the facility by which he's able to engage that and do it well brings a certain delight, Aristotle says. So once a person has gotten to the point where they can suffer well or engage in something that's very difficult, then at a certain point, even though it's still difficult, it will also become less difficult, but it brings a certain amount of delight with it. So, yeah. Yes.
Father, you mentioned somewhere if a child watches too much TV, especially when they're very young,
Yeah.
that it could actually cause brain damage.
Yeah.
Can that be reversed?
Not to my... I don't know. The studies just observe it.
The answer is yes when it comes to the visual system, so I suspect it's the same for the brain. The young mind up to about the age of 10, 11, 12 is a lot of neurons forming connections.
Right.
And whether those connections form or not is very, very malleable and very pliant in those first 10, 11, 12 years. That's why children are sponges. They can pick up language, they can pick up music, they can pick up a lot of different things. Once they get past a certain stage, then you can't unlearn those things. And that's one of the factors in amblyopia, where if an eye is deprived of light and sight, the connections between that eye and the brain don't form. They can reform up until the age of about 10, 11, 12 if you start patching the other eye and forcing the child to use that weak eye. So I suspect it's the same thing with the brain. It's just a matter of retraining it, but it's up to a certain point.
Yeah.
And then at that point things are hardwired and you can't get past it.
Yeah, I
So
suspect so too.
someone is brought up on the TV and watching it a lot. When they become an adult,
There's a bit of
just have that
compromise.
brain damage.
I don't know about, I suspect you're actually right, Doctor, but I think that part of the, I haven't seen any studies that show, I think that there's jury's still out, probably to some degree, that they haven't done the studies to see how much it can be reversed. So.
But that would be a cause of the ADD then, would it not?
Yeah, when I grew up, ADD was solved by getting SWATs.
Yeah.
Right. You just needed something that would override his other stuff to give him focus. Right? That's right. And so the kid would actually develop it. Now, there are some people that legitimately the brain structure and stuff like that they're going to have a hard time their whole life focusing. But a lot of times it's just bad training and habits in the kid. So
as an adult, once the damage is done with the TV, when a person's an adult, then they still have that.
I had a friend of mine growing up who had ADD as a kid. His parents put him on Ritalin, and he later in life thought, I wonder if that didn't cause some kind of brain damage, because he could study things and grasp it. He did well in school, but he had to put an enormous amount of energy, and it took him a lot of energy, and things didn't come very rapidly to him. Right, and he suspects, and I think that's actually true, and I think there might even be studies, Doctor might know this, but there's some studies that have been showing that there is some stuff that's some brain damage that's being caused. Did he compensate for it? Yeah, he got to the point where he could study stuff fairly well, but never to the point where, he might have otherwise.
Well, could the damage be maybe more in, always, needing that distraction and not being able to look at, the deeper questions in life, like who am I, where am I going, what am I doing,
right?
That kind of thing. Just because the distraction, you just follow the distraction.
Action, yeah, which is probably it's probably more a case of habit, which can be undone, but it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. This is one of the reasons really why, when kids are younger, they can have screen time, but it should be severely curtailed, and they should be encouraged to do things that are more likely to develop them based upon their developmental stage. And then, as kids get past, once they get to the age of reason and stuff, and they're starting to read, the encouragement should be really to emphasize the reading, because it's going to develop the habits for intellectual virtues, because develop the intellectual virtues. And they can, again, have more screen time. There comes a certain point, though, at a certain point when a kid gets to puberty, he's got to be able to regulate it himself at a certain stage, because that's part of the virtue of temperance. If he doesn't, if the parents are the ones regulating it all the time, well, he doesn't have any virtue. So that's one of the reasons why, and again, I don't think it's evil. Obviously, in relationship to the internet and even TV, you have to have some filters on the internet, or self-filtering, because if you don't, inadvertently you're going to see stuff that is really bad, and so there has to be a little bit of stuff done on that level. But the internet again is not something that's evil. It's just it's being used by and large for evil purposes. Because last statistic I read, they said at any one given time, 50% of the bandwidth on the internet is burned up by pornography. So this is, in fact, pornography is the number one thing. The pornography sites are the number one sites that are visited. So I think the only ones that get probably more traffic is Google, but that's only because they're funneling people to the porn sites. So, but the point being is that it's like anything else. They're good things. It's just that have to be moderated, and the parents have to teach the children. You have to, these are good things. You should use them. You can even use them for delightful purposes now and then, or even for entertainment purposes. But you need to make the choice to moderate these selves for your own sake. Because that's ultimately what the real issue is. And because it's, especially things like the internet, TV, it is, but not as much as something like the internet and also the phone. It plugs into our natural desire for knowledge, even about particular things, so well. And as a medium, it fits us so well. As I mentioned, it almost mirrors our imagination and everything. It fits it so well that it becomes something that's so easy to use. And so that's another reason we have to be careful with it. Which just tells you it's a good thing. It's like anything else when it's good. You have to be really careful with it. So, any other questions? Yeah.
So the same thing applies with television. You have to be careful with what you're watching.
Yeah. So it's what you watch, how long you're watching it, etc.
And the content and
Yeah.
all the rules regarding modesty and speech.
Yeah, and I actually talk about that. I mean, I talk about it in other places, but the book, The Principle of the Integral Good, I talk about it in there. Just lay out the principles, because it's really a matter of principles. People say, well, can't you just tell me what I have to know? Because there's so many variations, and every time you turn around, they're coming up with something new. You just need to know the principles, and principles will tell you what to do in the concrete. Okay. If there's no other questions, sorry.
As far as its effect on interpersonal relations, I've noticed some things, like some people, if you try to engage in the conversation, they'll give you a 2-3 word answer, but they're kind of looking at you like you're supposed to entertain them. I don't know what. I'm wondering how it affects your personal relations as far as. Well,
basically, what happens is if that stuff isn't moderated, if you yourself cannot provide the level of pleasure that they're getting out of the machine, they're going to just focus on the machine. So it does fracture personalities. I mean, they're talking about this all the time, right? Even on TV, at the dinner table, no cell phones, right? That kind of a thing. So, and that's just because it forces people to actually interact. And so that's another reason it should be moderated, because it does affect people's relationships. The other thing is if a person continually makes the choice to feed that pleasure without moderating it, essentially they're becoming selfish. And so their attitude towards you is, if you're not going to give me what I want, then I'm not going to have anything to do with you, because I want what I want when I want it, and I can get this machine will provide it. So, which is why people are becoming more and more fractured. And it's interesting because they're starting to do more studies too, even about pornography. What they're discovering with pornography is because the medium provides a certain amount of pleasure, the pornography adds to that. And so what's happening is that it's destroying marriages, not just because the spouses are essentially being emotionally unfaithful through watching pornography, but because of the fact that they're getting so focused on that thing provides them a level of pleasure that normal interaction doesn't give them. And so it's destroying it. They're talking about this, that one of the biggest problems among the millennials is they don't have normal conjugal lives. Again, it's a tool. Like one of the things that they discovered, there was this one kid who, he had autism, and his mother was one of the first people to discover that with autistic kids, in fact, she developed this teaching method for autistic kids. She's got her PhD, but what she was doing is the kid couldn't focus, right, because he had autism. So she just kept bringing it back, kept putting the thing in front of him, and eventually it started to get to the point where he could have some facility with it, but it got to the point he could have no social interaction with people. But what he could do is that is he could, the computer, he could communicate via the computer. And so he was asked, why don't you look at me when I'm talking to you? And he said, it's because the sensory overload is so powerful emotionally, I can't handle it. Right, which makes sense, right? That's why they turn away from it and get away from it. So the point being is that it's a useful tool. It's a good thing. It's like any other tool, you know. If you have a hammer, you don't use it to drive screws in, right? So you use it as a hammer, and you don't walk around with your hammer all the time. I mean, that's just a little weird. Well, it's the same thing with this stuff. It's just that we don't see that because, normally speaking, people don't get a lot of pleasure out of carrying a hammer around, but they do their telephone, right? So it's a tool. It's like anything else, and so that's something that's got to, you know, we have to look. Our view of the thing has to change. Really, is what it has to happen. So, okay. Well, if you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et mane et semper. Amen.
Amen.